We traveled to UN headquarters in New York City before the pandemic.
China has made great improvements on both the income side as well as on the multidimensional poverty side. But the headcount poverty rate, meaning the number of people living in multidimensional poverty, is still a little bit higher than the number of people living in income poverty in China. But the story is a story of dramatic reductions, and over a fairly short period of time by historical standards, of poverty, both income poverty as well as multidimensional poverty.
Pedro is the lead author of the UN Human Development Program. Each year, his office collects data from every country. China is the only one to have moved from the low human development category to the high human development category since the UNDP first began analyzing global trends in 1990.
It's basically cramming 100 years worth of reforms in 30 years. It's just remarkable to watch what's happened. But as China moves on in this process, and President Xi Jinping has talked about a moderately prosperous society in 2020, he set that goal, does it become more and more difficult getting the ones who are furthest behind?
I think so, not only in China but elsewhere also. As we approach lower levels of poverty and very low levels of poverty in some instances, it becomes more difficult to get to what we call that last mile of exclusion. In part because the challenges may be very varied and the reasons why people are left behind may be fairly different, in part because sometimes it relates to people that have already moved above the poverty line and then are thrown back into poverty as a result of shocks like disease, a illness, or being hit by a natural disaster. So it becomes a more dynamic and more complex story as we get towards the last mile of exclusion.
But are there some lessons from the way China lifted people out of poverty that perhaps could work in other countries?
I think the biggest lesson of the Chinese experience in reducing poverty, as well as other countries that have been successful, is that there is no single way of doing it. Each country has to learn and understand what are the constraints they face and what are the measures that they need to put in place to address those constraints. So in China, the biggest impact on poverty reduction initially had to do with what happened to rural populations. So what we saw in China over the course of the 1980s was a revolution in agricultural productivity that enabled many people in rural areas to move above the poverty line. Other countries may face a different constraint. If a country doesn't face the challenge of having a large rural population living in poverty like China did in 1979, 1980, then the constraints that country has to address are different. But we saw, for instance, in Vietnam, where the path was quite similar to one that we observe in China. The reduction of poverty in Vietnam was also driven by a revolution in agriculture productivity with a sharp reduction in poverty in rural areas. So once again, I think the most important lesson from China is understand the context, understand the opportunities and the challenges that you confront, and chart a path that addresses those constraints.
As part of its poverty alleviation program, the Chinese government aims to install millions of solar panels, especially in the poorest parts of eastern China. Researchers estimate the program will cost around $4 billion throughout its 5-year implementation period and could benefit more than 2 million people by the end of this year.
So Pedro, it's really interesting. Earlier in my career, I was on the board of the Capital Area Food Bank. And hunger and poverty, I guess in many respects, they're kind of there's a linkage there. And I remember the executive director saying to me one time that this is kind of invisible. You could be on the subway with somebody who's really struggling. They don't have any food. They don't really have much in the way of income. And they could sit right next to you and you don't see it. So talk to me about the invisibility of this issue. And is that a struggle?
It is a struggle because poverty has many dimensions, has many forms.
So It's multidimensional in many respects, isn't it?
Absolutely. Poverty is multidimensional, and that's why if we look at the 2030 Agenda and Sustainable Development Goal number 1, now it speaks about elimination of poverty in all its forms. If you compare it with the Millennium Development Goals that were adopted by the United Nations in the year 2000, it called for the elimination of income poverty, or not even elimination, but reduction by half. So with the Sustainable Development Goals, we have a much more ambitious agenda, not only in the aspiration to eliminate poverty, but to do it in all its forms.
And making it a goal, instead of let's reduce poverty, you can come up with any kind of target you want there, but eliminating it, that's really a stretch.
I agree.
Is that important to set a goal that's very lofty?
I think so, because it changes the way in which policymakers approach the problem. Because reducing poverty by half, you always tolerate people coming in and out of poverty, because if on average you keep people, the poverty rate coming down, you're okay. But if you are concerned with eliminating poverty, you have to pull people out of poverty once and for all. You cannot tolerate that people go back into poverty if they get sick or if they had hit by a disaster. So it changes the way in which policymakers approach the challenge of eliminating as opposed to reducing poverty.
In 2019, China allocated $130 billion for poverty alleviation funds, and President Xi has pushed for stricter oversight of poverty alleviation funds management. Around 800,000 government officials went door to door to find ways the government could assist the poor.
I was reading an article in preparation for this, and this person had written that in Australia, for example, 1 in 6 children live in income poverty. But in the United Kingdom, where government spending on children has fallen dramatically in recent years, child poverty is at 30%. So I guess, is that another obstacle that suddenly you start to see improvements, people take their eye off the ball, move in a different direction, and then you see a scaling back, and the problem resurfaces?
Yes, I think we can never rest when it comes to elimination of poverty. It's a battle that we need to be constantly fighting. But also, the standards against which we measure and determine poverty also shift over time. So, in most developed countries, the standard to measure poverty is a relative one. It's measured relative to how well the population as a whole is doing. While in many developing countries, and the international goal for income poverty is still an absolute standard. It's ensuring that people move above a certain minimum threshold of income. So poverty reduction in that sense is a moving target, because as we move people above extreme poverty, then we start becoming worried about measures of relative poverty. How do we tackle relative poverty? And then that takes us also to issues of distribution of income and inequality.
Here in the United States, I've heard some people who are involved in this say that, it's where you're born, it's your zip code. And in many respects, it's where you're born, in what country you're born, or what city you're born in. How do you address that?
It's true. It's what it's a regular pattern that we see in many countries, that where you're born, who your parents are, determines to a large extent the level of income that you have as an adult. It's not the same thing everywhere, so it shows that it's possible with the right policies, with the right institutions, to make sure that everyone has a fairer shot at making progress in life.
According to the World Bank, the coronavirus pandemic could push as many as 60 million people into extreme poverty. It's expected that sub-Saharan Africa will suffer the most. At least 23 million people in the region are projected to be headed for extreme poverty.
I was in Somalia back in 1992, and it was heartbreaking. I mean, you've got a drought, you've got a civil war, you've got people dying, and yet you look at Somalia today, and it still is struggling. What is it about certain countries that they just can't seem to kind of turn the page? And what can a government, a body like yours, the United Nations, do to help them turn that page?
You're right. I mean, if we look at the overall picture of development is one that we can characterize as a successful journey, in that we've been able to lift, when I say we, I mean the countries themselves, not necessarily the international community, but the international community also played a role at lifting many people out of poverty. But it's true that many countries have been left behind. So not only people are left behind, but many countries are left behind. Often this is related to conflict tensions, political tensions, that are complex, grounded in history, increasingly also grounded in competition or conflicts over resources. Many of these places are contexts, defined by contexts in which there is competition over land or water or other resources that make the lives of these populations very, very challenging.
And then you see people in Syria, other war-torn areas. I mean, Yemen comes to mind, trying to migrate elsewhere. You see a lot of countries now that want to shut the door on them. That has to factor into all of this as well. And how do you address that?
Absolutely. And in fact, a large number of people are displaced within their own countries, within their own nations. And so it's important that the international community and all countries do have a position that enables everyone to address the challenge of displaced populations. And the majority actually happens within developing countries themselves.
The annual Human Development Report focuses on three key aspects: life expectancy, access to education, and a decent standard of living. The report essentially measures the progress each country is making in improving the lives of its citizens by focusing on people rather than income and economic growth.
One of the things I saw in one of your addresses, you said going beyond income. And there were a couple other going beyond. Do you think we get fixated on some of these issues like income and we need to move past that and look at other more dimensions?
I think so. And that's in fact the human development approach that we use in our reports, in the human development reports, in my office, in Human Development Report Office. And the idea is fairly simple. The idea is that what matters for people is the ability to live lives according to their aspirations, their expectations. Of course, income is one dimension, but if you have income and are not healthy or didn't have a chance to have an education, then there's only so much that income can do for you. So we need a more comprehensive approach, and that's what the human development approach tries to measure, as well as the multidimensional poverty measure that we discussed earlier. So income is important, but there are other dimensions that matter for people's lives.
Talk to us about gender. How does it factor in?
Gender is one of the perennial challenges that we face, or I should say gender inequality. And in the last Human Development Report that we published just this past December, we actually document something that was quite striking, that has to do with social norms, so how societies see progress towards gender equality. And what we found that was surprising was that in many countries we're seeing a backlash against gender equality, not by policymakers necessarily, but by what society seems to be suggesting, as reflected in opinion poll surveys. So we see in many countries actually a regression in positions that would support gender equality.
How do you reverse that?
Well, policies are important, so policies have a role to play. Education is important, and also having measures that target both what women and men do. So having men that are role models and leaders also in ensuring that we have gender equality. This is another example where I think that by focusing on the economic dimensions of gender inequality, which are important, we miss the point and may miss opportunities to address these more deeply entrenched social norms that sometimes stand in the way of gender equality. So it's more difficult than sometimes it may seem at first sight.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.